The morning sun peeked through the clouds as Ruth checked herself in the mirror one last time. She smoothed down her favorite blue cardigan, the one with the slightly frayed sleeve that she kept meaning to fix. At 73, Ruth didn't fuss much about her appearance these days. Her silver hair was neatly brushed and she wore her comfortable walking shoes, the sensible kind that her doctor recommended for her occasional knee pain. "Are you sure you don't want me to come with you?" called her husband Thomas from the kitchen where he was fixing his usual morning toast. "I'll be just fine," Ruth replied with a smile. "I want it to be a surprise, remember?" Thomas and Ruth had been married for 50 years next month. 50 years of building a life together, raising 2 children who now had families of their own, and working hard to secure their future. Thomas had always been the one to handle their finances, making smart investments over the years while Ruth had managed their home with the same careful attention. But 3 weeks ago, Ruth had received an unexpected letter. Her brother Harold, who had passed away 6 months earlier, had left her a substantial inheritance. It was more money than Ruth had ever imagined having at once, and after the initial shock wore off, she knew exactly what she wanted to do with some of it. Thomas had been driving the same car for nearly 15 years. It was reliable enough, but lately it had been making concerning noises, and the air conditioning had given up completely last summer. Ruth had decided it was time for him to have something nice, something that showed how much she appreciated all those years of him taking care of their family. "I'll be back before lunch," Ruth called as she grabbed her practical handbag and the folder containing the inheritance paperwork. Thomas waved from the kitchen, completely unaware of what she was planning. The bus dropped Ruth off just a block from Lux Motors, the dealership she had researched online with her granddaughter's help. According to their website, they specialized in luxury vehicles, and Ruth thought Thomas deserved something special for once in his life. As she walked through the gleaming glass doors of the dealership, Ruth felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. The showroom was immaculate, with polished marble floors that reflected the dazzling vehicles displayed throughout the space. Cars in colors she didn't even know existed gleamed under strategic lighting, making them look like art pieces rather than transportation. Ruth paused just inside the entrance, taking it all in. A few salespeople in crisp suits moved around the floor, speaking with the occasional customer. No one immediately approached her, though a young man at a desk near the door glanced up briefly before returning to his computer screen. Gathering her courage, Ruth began to wander among the vehicles. She ran her hand gently along the side of a sleek silver sedan, admiring how the paint felt cool and smooth beneath her fingers. The price tag attached to the windshield made her blink twice. It was more than they had paid for their first house. But thanks to Harold's inheritance, it was within her budget now. After a few minutes of browsing, Ruth noticed 2 salesmen whispering to each other while glancing in her direction. One of them, a tall man with slicked back hair and an expensive-looking watch, nudged the other and chuckled before straightening his tie and approaching her. "Can I help you find something, ma'am?" he asked with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The name badge on his perfectly pressed suit read, "Daniel." "Yes, please," Ruth said brightly. "I'm looking for a car for my husband. Something comfortable but special. It's our 50th anniversary next month." Daniel's eyes flickered over Ruth's simple clothes and practical shoes. "That's a lovely. What sort of budget did you have in mind for this anniversary gift?" Before Ruth could answer, he continued, "We do have some very nice used models at our sister location just down the street. Much more appropriate for most budgets." He emphasized the word in a way that made Ruth feel small. "Actually," Ruth said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I was interested in this model here." She gestured toward the silver sedan she had been admiring. "Or perhaps that blue one over there. I'd like to know more about both." Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly. "The S-Class? Well, these start at just under $110,000, and with the premium package which this one has, you're looking at closer to $130,000. He said the numbers slowly as if expecting them to frighten her away. Ruth nodded, unfazed. "That sounds reasonable. Could I take a closer look at the interior?" A flicker of irritation crossed Daniel's face, quickly replaced by his professional smile. "Of course." He opened the door for her with a flourish that seemed somewhat mocking. Ruth carefully lowered herself into the driver's seat, breathing in the rich smell of new leather. The inside of the car was like nothing she'd ever seen before. screens and buttons and wood paneling that gleamed in the showroom lights. She placed her hands on the steering wheel, imagining Thomas sitting here, his face lighting up when she handed him the keys. "It's quite comfortable," she remarked, looking up at Daniel, who stood watching her with poorly disguised impatience. "It's our most luxurious model," he replied mechanically. "Now, perhaps we should discuss financing options that might be more suitable for your situation. As I mentioned, our pre-owned department—" "I won't need financing," Ruth interrupted gently. "I'd be paying in full." Daniel let out a short laugh that he quickly tried to disguise as a cough. "I see. Well, these vehicles require substantial down payments regardless. Perhaps it would be best if you brought your son or daughter with you to discuss the details. Or your husband." Ruth felt a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. "I don't need my children to help me buy a car, young man. I have the funds available." She reached for her handbag, intending to show him the paperwork from the inheritance. "Ma'am," Daniel said, his tone now clearly condescending. "I understand you want to surprise your husband, but I think we both know this isn't the right place for you. I have customers with serious buying potential waiting, so I'll have to ask you to—" "Is there a problem here?" a deeper voice interrupted. Ruth looked up to see another man in an even nicer suit approaching. His badge identified him as Peter, the floor manager. "No problem," Daniel said smoothly. "I was just explaining to this lady that she might be more comfortable at our used car location." The manager looked Ruth over with the same dismissive glance that Daniel had given her. "Ah, I see. Yes, I think that would be best." Ruth felt her hands begin to tremble slightly with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "Excuse me, but I came here to purchase a car. I have the means to do so, and I'd appreciate being treated with respect." The manager's smile tightened. "Ma'am, we value all our visitors, but we also know our clientele. Our vehicles represent significant investments, and we need to be certain customers are qualified." "And how exactly would you know if I'm qualified if you won't even let me tell you about my situation?" Ruth asked, her voice rising slightly despite her best efforts to stay calm. A few other customers had begun to glance in their direction, and the manager's smile disappeared completely. "I think it would be best if you left now. Perhaps come back with your husband if you're serious about purchasing." Ruth stood up from the driver's seat, clutching her handbag tightly. "I don't need my husband's permission to spend my own money." "Security?" the manager called over his shoulder, not even bothering to lower his voice. A heavy-set man in a dark uniform appeared almost instantly, as if he'd been waiting for the call. "Ma'am, I'll need to escort you out," he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. Ruth felt tears of humiliation burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. With as much dignity as she could muster, she straightened her cardigan and nodded. "There's no need. I can find my own way out." As she walked toward the exit, she could hear Daniel and the manager speaking in low voices, followed by muffled laughter. The security guard followed a few steps behind her, as if afraid she might try to steal something on her way out. Outside, the bright day seemed to mock her embarrassment. Ruth stood on the sidewalk for a moment, willing her racing heart to slow down. A young couple walked past her into the dealership and were immediately greeted with warm smiles by the same staff who had just thrown her out. The bus ride home was a blur. Ruth sat by the window, watching the familiar streets pass by without really seeing them. The folder with her inheritance paperwork remained unopened in her bag, proof she never got the chance to show. When she finally reached home, Thomas was in the garden, tending to his tomato plants. One look at her face told him something was wrong. "Ruth? What happened?" "Are you all right?" he asked, quickly wiping his hands on his gardening apron and coming to meet her. For a moment, Ruth considered not telling him. The humiliation was still fresh, a knot of indignity lodged in her throat, but in 50 years of marriage they had never kept secrets from each other. "I wanted to surprise you," she began, her voice cracking slightly. "With Harold's inheritance money, I thought I could buy you a nice new car." Thomas guided her to the porch swing, his arm gentle around her shoulders. As they sat down together, the story spilled out. The dealership, the dismissive treatment, being escorted out like some kind of criminal. "They didn't even give me a chance to show them the paperwork," Ruth finished, finally allowing a tear to escape. "They just looked at my clothes, my age, and decided I couldn't possibly be worth their time." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, His jaw clenched in a way Ruth recognized from the rare times when he was truly angry. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but with a steely edge she hadn't heard in years. "Well," he said, squeezing her hand gently, "I think Lux Motors is about to learn a very expensive lesson about judging books by their covers." Ruth looked at him questioningly, but Thomas just smiled and kissed her forehead. "Don't worry about it now. Let's have some lunch and I'll tell you about my plan." What Ruth didn't know then was that Thomas had spent 40 years building connections in the business world before his retirement. And by this time tomorrow, Lux Motors would deeply regret how they had treated his wife. Thomas sat across from Ruth at their kitchen table, watching as she pushed her vegetable soup around with her spoon. She hadn't eaten much since they'd come inside, the memory of her humiliation still fresh and painful. The kitchen was filled with afternoon sunlight, warming the space they had shared for over 30 years. But today it couldn't seem to lift the cloud that had settled over Ruth. "You should eat something," Thomas said gently, reaching across to touch her hand. Ruth nodded and took a small spoonful, more to please him than from any real appetite. "I just keep thinking about how they looked at me," she said after a moment. "Like I was nothing. Like I wasn't even worth their time." Thomas's face hardened slightly, the lines around his mouth deepening. At 75, his once dark hair was now completely silver, but the sharp intelligence in his eyes hadn't dulled with age. He had retired as CEO of Wilson Investment Partners 10 years ago, handing the company over to their son. But he had maintained many of his business relationships and still sat on several boards. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said. "From the beginning." Ruth set down her spoon and took a deep breath. As she recounted the details, the whispering salesman, Daniel's condescending tone, the manager calling security, Thomas listened without interrupting. Only the slight tightening of his jaw and the way his fingers drummed quietly on the table betrayed his growing anger. "And they never even looked at your inheritance paperwork?" he asked when she had finished. "They never gave me the chance," Ruth replied, a flush of embarrassment coloring her cheeks again. "They just assumed I couldn't afford anything because of how I look." Thomas nodded slowly. During his career, he had seen plenty of prejudice, against the young, the old, women, minorities. But it always angered him. He and Ruth had raised their children to judge people by their character, not their appearance or age. "You know," he said, getting up to refill his coffee cup, "I've always believed that people reveal their true nature in how they treat those they think can't benefit them." Ruth watched as he stirred a small spoonful of sugar into his coffee, his one daily indulgence. "What are you thinking, Thomas?" "I know that look." A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I'm thinking that Lux Motors made a very expensive mistake today." He glanced at the clock on the wall. "It's just past 2. If I make a few calls now, what are you planning?" Ruth asked, suddenly concerned. In 50 years of marriage, she had never seen Thomas seek revenge even when wronged. Not revenge, he assured her, reading her expression perfectly. Just a lesson in respect and good business practice. He picked up his phone and walked into his study, closing the door softly behind him. Ruth sat at the table for a few more minutes before getting up to clear the dishes. Whatever Thomas was planning, she trusted him completely. In all their years together, he had never given her reason to doubt his judgment. In his study, Thomas settled into his worn leather chair and began making calls. The first was to George Phillips, an old friend who owned Phillips Luxury Automobiles, a direct competitor to Lux Motors with dealerships across the state. "George, it's Thomas Wilson. Yes, it has been too long. Listen, I need a favor and it might benefit you as well." The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes with Thomas explaining the situation and what he had in mind. By the end, George was not only willing to help but seemed genuinely eager to do so. "Tomorrow at 10? Perfect. And you'll have it delivered here by 9:30? Excellent. Thank you, George. I owe you one." The next call was to Linda Chen, a former board member who now ran the city's most respected newspaper. "Linda, how are you? I was wondering if you might have a reporter available tomorrow morning for a potentially interesting story." As the afternoon progressed, Thomas made several more calls. To anyone passing by the study, they might have seemed like casual conversations with old friends and colleagues, but each one carefully laid the groundwork for what would happen the next day. When he finally emerged from his study nearly 2 hours later, Ruth was sitting in the living room, knitting a sweater for their youngest granddaughter. She looked up when he entered, a question in her eyes. "All set," Thomas said with a smile that reminded Ruth of when they were young, a mixture of mischief and confidence that had always made her heart beat a little faster. But I'll need your help with one thing. What's that? She asked, setting aside her knitting. I need you to tell me exactly who you dealt with at the dealership. Names, descriptions, everything you can remember. Ruth closed her eyes briefly, trying to recall the details. The salesman's name was Daniel. Tall, probably in his 30s, slicked back hair. Very expensive watch. He made sure I noticed it. The manager was older, maybe 50, going gray at the temples. His name tag said Peter. And there was a security guard, heavy-set, but I didn't get his name. Thomas nodded, committing the details to memory. Perfect. Now what do you say we have a nice dinner and an early night? Tomorrow is going to be an interesting day. That evening, they ate at their small kitchen table as they had for decades, but there was a new energy in the air, a sense of anticipation that made the simple meal of baked chicken and vegetables taste better somehow. Thomas even opened a bottle of wine they had been saving for a special occasion. To standing up for what's right, he said, raising his glass to Ruth. She clinked her glass against his, smiling despite her lingering unease. Will you tell me what you're planning now? Thomas took a sip of his wine before answering. Let's just say that Lux Motors is about to learn that appearances can be deceiving. After dinner, Thomas disappeared into their bedroom and began sorting through his closet. Ruth watched from the doorway as he pulled out his best suit, the charcoal gray one he had worn to their daughter's wedding, along with a crisp white shirt and his favorite blue tie. You're dressing up? She asked, surprised. Thomas rarely wore suits since his retirement, preferring the comfort of casual clothes as they went about their daily lives. Image is everything in this little lesson, he replied, laying the suit carefully on the bed and checking it for wrinkles. And these people seem to put a lot of stock in appearances. That night, as they lay in bed, Ruth could tell Thomas was still awake long after she had begun to drift off. His mind was working, planning, making sure every detail was in place for whatever he had set in motion. Thomas, she said softly in the darkness, promise me you won't do anything extreme. He chuckled and pulled her closer. I promise. But I also promise that by this time tomorrow, those people at Lux Motors will never judge a customer by their clothes again. Ruth fell asleep with her head on his shoulder, comforted by his warmth and the steady rhythm of his breathing. Whatever happened tomorrow, they would face it together as they had faced everything for the past 50 years. Morning came with the gentle chiming of their bedside clock. Thomas was up before the alarm, moving with purpose as he showered and dressed. Ruth watched as he transformed from her comfortable, retired husband into the formidable businessman he had once been. The suit fit him perfectly, and when he added his good watch and the tie clip she had given him for their 40th anniversary, he looked every inch the successful executive. How do I look? He asked, adjusting his tie in the mirror. Handsome as the day I married you, Ruth replied with a smile. It wasn't flattery. Despite the years that had passed, Thomas still carried himself with the same dignity and confidence that had first attracted her to him. They had just finished breakfast when the doorbell rang. Thomas checked his watch and nodded as if confirming that everything was on schedule. Right on time, he said, heading for the front door. Ruth followed, curious about this first part of his plan. When Thomas opened the door, a young man in a uniform stood on their porch beside the most beautiful car Ruth had ever seen. It was a Rolls-Royce gleaming silver in the morning sunlight, its iconic grille and Spirit of Ecstasy hood ornament immediately recognizable even to someone who knew little about luxury cars. Mr. Wilson? The young man asked. Mr. Phillips sent this over for you. He said you'd know what to do with it. Thomas smiled broadly, shaking the young man's hand. Please thank George for me. This is perfect. The young man handed Thomas a set of keys and a folder of paperwork. It's all gassed up and ready to go. Mr. Phillips said to tell you it's yours for as long as you need it. After the delivery man left, Ruth stared at the magnificent vehicle parked in their driveway. Their modest home, well kept but unassuming, seemed almost comically mismatched with the luxury car. Thomas, she breathed, what exactly are you planning to do? He pocketed the keys and checked his watch again. I'm going to pay a visit to Lux Motors, and if my timing is right, a reporter from the Daily Chronicle will happen to be there as well, working on a story about customer service in luxury businesses. Ruth's eyes widened as she began to understand. You're going to go there in that car dressed like this, looking every bit like their ideal customer, Thomas finished for her. And then I'm going to introduce myself as Ruth Wilson's husband. For the first time since yesterday's humiliation, Ruth felt a genuine smile spread across her face. It wasn't about revenge, and it was about justice, about standing up for dignity and respect. In that moment, she fell in love with Thomas all over again, as she had countless times throughout their marriage. "Be careful," she said, straightening his already perfect tie. "And come home with a good story to tell." Thomas kissed her softly. "I always do." He walked down the path to the Rolls-Royce, looking as if he had driven such cars all his life. Before getting in, he turned back to Ruth, still standing in the doorway. "I love you," he called. "I love you too," she replied, watching as he slid into the driver's seat of the magnificent car. The Rolls-Royce handled like a dream as Thomas navigated the familiar streets of their town. He had driven many luxury cars during his career, but there was something special about a Rolls-Royce, a sense of history and craftsmanship that few other vehicles could match. George had outdone himself by sending this particular model, a ghost with a price tag north of $350,000. As he drove, Thomas rehearsed what he would say when he arrived at the dealership. He wasn't a man given to outbursts or dramatic confrontations. Throughout his business career, he had found that quiet confidence was far more effective than shouting. Today would be no different. He wanted to teach a lesson, not create a scene. He pulled into a coffee shop parking lot about 2 blocks from Lux Motors and checked his watch. It was 9:45 a.m. He had asked Linda to have her reporter arrive at around 10:15, which gave him time to make one more call. "Hello, this is Joseph at Williams & Sons Law Firm," a friendly voice answered after 2 rings. "Joe, it's Thomas Wilson." "Tom, great to hear from you. How's retirement treating you?" Thomas smiled. He and Joseph had been friends since college, and Joseph had handled all the legal work for Wilson Investment Partners for decades before they both retired. "Can't complain. Listen, Joe, I'm about to walk into a situation, and I'd like to have you on standby just in case." He briefly explained what had happened to Ruth and what he was planning to do. Joseph listened without interrupting, then chuckled softly. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Tom. I'm sitting at my desk with nothing pressing today. Call me if you need me, and I'll be there in 15 minutes. "Thanks, Joe. Hopefully it won't come to that." Thomas ended the call and took a moment to center himself. This wasn't just about getting back at the people who had humiliated Ruth. It was about making sure they understood why their behavior was wrong and ensuring they didn't treat anyone else that way in the future. At exactly 10 a.m., he pulled the Rolls-Royce into the Lux Motors parking lot, deliberately choosing a spot right in front of the main entrance where it would be impossible to miss. He stepped out of the car and straightened his tie, enjoying the immediate attention the vehicle was attracting. A young couple entering the dealership stopped to admire it, and Thomas noticed several salespeople inside glancing out through the glass doors. He smiled politely at the couple before making his way toward the entrance. As he approached, he saw a woman with a professional camera getting out of a car in the far corner of the lot. Right on time, Linda's reporter was here. The moment Thomas pushed through the glass doors into the showroom, the atmosphere changed. He could feel eyes turning toward him, partly because of his well-tailored suit and confident bearing, but mostly because of the Rolls-Royce he had just stepped out of. A young receptionist at the front desk immediately straightened in her chair, her phone call forgotten as she watched him enter. Thomas took his time, scanning the showroom as if assessing the vehicles on display. He spotted Daniel almost immediately. The slicked-back hair and flashy watch were just as Ruth had described. The salesman was speaking with an older gentleman near a sports car, but kept glancing in Thomas's direction, clearly eager to break away and approach the new, promising customer. Peter, the floor manager, emerged from an office at the back, his eyes lighting up at the sight of Thomas. He adjusted his tie and began walking briskly across the showroom floor, determined to reach this potential high-value client before any of his salespeople could. Thomas pretended not to notice, instead pausing to admire a luxury sedan similar to the one Ruth had been interested in. He ran his hand along the polished surface, bending slightly to peer inside. "Good morning, sir," Peter said as he approached, his voice warm and ingratiating. "Welcome to Lux Motors. I'm Peter Davis, the floor manager. That's quite a beautiful machine you drove up in." Thomas turned slowly, offering a measured smile and a firm handshake. Thank you. She's a fine car. The Ghost is exceptional, Peter continued, clearly trying to establish rapport by demonstrating his knowledge. The 6.75-liter twin-turbo V12 is a masterpiece of engineering. Thomas nodded, allowing Peter to believe they were connecting. I've always appreciated quality craftsmanship. Tell me, do you have that same attention to detail here at Lux Motors? Absolutely, sir, Peter said eagerly. We pride ourselves on offering the finest vehicles and customer service. I'd be happy to show you our most exclusive models personally. By now, Daniel had excused himself from his other customer and was hovering nearby, waiting for an opportunity to introduce himself. Thomas could see the hunger in his eyes. The Rolls-Royce outside and Thomas's appearance had marked him as the kind of client salespeople dream about. Actually, Thomas said, I'm interested in this model here. He gestured to the sedan he had been examining. My wife was looking at something similar yesterday. A flicker of confusion crossed Peter's face. Your wife was here yesterday. I meet so many customers. I don't recall. Yes, Thomas said calmly. Ruth Wilson. Older lady, silver hair, blue cardigan. She was interested in purchasing a car as a surprise for our anniversary. The color drained from Peter's face as recognition dawned. Behind him, Daniel had frozen mid-step, his eager smile faltering. Thomas watched as they exchanged a quick, panicked glance. Mr. Wilson, Peter began, his voice suddenly strained. That's right, Thomas interrupted pleasantly. Ruth Wilson's husband, the woman you had escorted out by security yesterday, because you judged her incapable of affording your vehicles based solely on her appearance. The showroom had grown oddly quiet. Other customers were glancing in their direction, drawn by the sudden tension in the air. Thomas maintained his smile, keeping his voice low and controlled. Perhaps we could continue this conversation in your office, he suggested, nodding toward the glass-walled room at the back of the showroom. Peter swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, of course. Right this way, Mr. Wilson. As they walked toward the office, Thomas noticed the reporter from the Chronicle had entered the dealership and was casually browsing cars while taking notes. Perfect timing, Daniel, Peter called over his shoulder. Please join us. The salesman looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, but he followed them toward the office, his confident swagger replaced by a nervous shuffle. Once inside the glass-walled office, Peter closed the door and gestured to a leather chair across from his desk. Mr. Wilson, I want to assure you that if there was any misunderstanding yesterday, there was no misunderstanding, Thomas said, remaining standing. My wife came here with the intention and ability to purchase a luxury vehicle as a gift for me. She was dismissed, belittled, and ultimately removed from the premises without being given the opportunity to demonstrate her financial capacity. Those are the facts, correct? Daniel looked at the floor, suddenly fascinated by his expensive shoes. Peter cleared his throat. Sir, if there was any discourtesy shown to your wife, I sincerely apologize. Your staff is trained to judge books by their covers, Thomas interrupted, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel now. To assess potential customers based on appearance rather than treating everyone with equal respect and dignity. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a business card, placing it on Peter's desk. It was cream-colored with simple, elegant text, Thomas Wilson, CEO, retired. Wilson Investment Partners. I spent 40 years building a company based on respect, integrity, and fairness, Thomas continued. During that time, I learned that the true measure of a business isn't how it treats its most valuable customers. It's how it treats everyone who walks through its doors. Peter stared at the card, then back at Thomas, clearly struggling to reconcile the distinguished businessman before him with the elderly woman in a cardigan from the day before. Mr. Wilson, I can't express how deeply sorry we are for this unfortunate incident. If there's anything we can do to make this right. Where is your owner? Thomas asked. I'd like to speak with him directly. Peter and Daniel exchanged another nervous glance. Mr. Anderson is actually out of the country on business, Peter explained. I'm the highest-ranking person on site. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. I see. Well then, I should tell you that I've taken the liberty of contacting several people about yesterday's incident. He began counting off on his fingers. Joseph Williams of Williams & Sons Law Firm, who has handled discrimination cases for many years. Linda Chen, the editor-in-chief of the Daily Chronicle, who found my wife's experience so interesting that she sent a reporter here this morning to do a piece on customer service practices in luxury businesses. He gestured toward the showroom, where the reporter was now openly taking photographs, and of course George Phillips, the owner of Phillips Luxury Automobiles, who was quite distressed to hear how a potential customer was treated by his competition. In fact, he was so concerned that he loaned me his personal Rolls-Royce this morning to drive over here. Peter's face had grown increasingly pale with each name Thomas mentioned. These weren't empty threats. These were powerful people in the community with real influence. "Mr. Wilson," he said, his voice almost a whisper now, "please understand that what happened yesterday does not reflect our company values. I take full responsibility, and I assure you we will address this immediately." Thomas finally took the seat across from Peter's desk, straightening the crease in his pants as he sat. "I'm glad to hear that. Now let's discuss how you plan to ensure this doesn't happen again." Outside the glass-walled office, the dealership continued its normal operations, but many eyes kept darting toward the intense conversation taking place. Daniel remained standing awkwardly to one side, looking like he wished the floor would open up and swallow him whole. The reporter from the Chronicle had positioned herself with a clear view of the office, occasionally snapping a photo or making notes. The story was shaping up to be much more interesting than the generic piece on luxury car customer service she had been assigned. Inside the office, Thomas leaned forward slightly. "I'm not interested in lawsuits or public humiliation, Mr. Davis. What interests me is change. Real, meaningful change in how you and your staff treat people who walk through those doors, regardless of how they're dressed or how old they are." Peter nodded eagerly. "Absolutely, Mr. Wilson, I completely agree. We can implement new training immediately, review all our customer service protocols, and perhaps," Thomas suggested mildly, "a formal written apology to my wife would be appropriate." "Of course," Peter agreed quickly. "I'll draft it myself today." Thomas checked his watch. It was nearly 10:45 a.m. "Very well. I believe we understand each other." He stood up and extended his hand. "I'll expect to see concrete changes, Mr. Davis, not just promises." Peter shot to his feet and shook Thomas's hand firmly. "You have my word, sir." As Thomas turned to leave, Daniel finally found his voice. "Mr. Wilson," he said hesitantly, "please extend my personal apologies to your wife. My behavior was inexcusable." Thomas studied the young man's face for a moment, seeing what appeared to be genuine remorse. "The measure of a person isn't that they never make mistakes, son. It's what they do afterward to make things right." With that, Thomas walked out of the office and across the showroom floor, aware of the eyes following him. As he reached the door, he paused to speak briefly with the reporter from the Chronicle, handing her his card as well. Outside, the Rolls-Royce gleamed in the late morning sun. Thomas slid behind the wheel, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and weariness. He hadn't raised his voice or made threats, but he had made his point. Sometimes the quietest lessons were the most effective. As he pulled out of the Lux Motors lot, he smiled to himself, imagining Ruth's face when he told her what had happened. She would probably scold him for making a fuss, then listen to every detail with barely concealed delight. After 50 years, he knew his wife better than he knew himself. Thomas pointed the Rolls-Royce toward home, already rehearsing how he would tell the story. Ruth deserved to hear every word. Ruth had spent the morning trying to distract herself with household tasks, but her mind kept wandering to Thomas and what might be happening at the dealership. She had swept the kitchen floor twice, reorganized the spice cabinet, and was now sitting at the dining room table with a cup of tea that had long gone cold, staring out the window. When she finally heard the distinctive purr of the Rolls-Royce pulling into their driveway, she almost knocked over her chair in her hurry to get to the front door. By the time Thomas was walking up the path, she was already standing on the porch, her hands clasped anxiously in front of her. "Well?" she asked as soon as he was within earshot. "What happened?" Thomas climbed the porch steps with a measured pace that told Ruth nothing about how things had gone. His expression was neutral, but there was a certain lightness to his step that gave her hope. "Let's go inside," he said, taking her hand. "It's quite a story." In the living room, Thomas loosened his tie and settled into his favorite armchair, while Ruth perched on the edge of the sofa, unable to contain her curiosity. "Tell me everything," she insisted. "Don't leave anything out." Thomas smiled, the kind of smile that had always made her heart skip even after 50 years of marriage. Well, I arrived driving George's Rolls-Royce, wearing my best suit. He recounted the entire encounter in detail, the immediate attention he received, the eagerness of Peter and Daniel to help him, and their shock when he revealed who he was. As he described the conversation in Peter's office, Ruth's expression shifted from anxiety to astonishment, and finally to a quiet satisfaction. "You didn't yell at them?" she asked when he had finished. Thomas shook his head. "No need. Sometimes the most powerful statement is made quietly." Ruth reached over and squeezed his hand. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not just for standing up for me, but for doing it with dignity." Thomas was about to respond when the phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and raised an eyebrow. "It's George," he said, picking up the receiver. "Hello?" Ruth could hear the faint sound of George's voice on the other end, though she couldn't make out the words. Whatever he was saying caused Thomas to chuckle. "You don't say? Well, that was faster than I expected. Yes, thank you for letting me know. No, I think I'll hold on to the car for another day if that's all right. Yes, she's right here. I'll tell her. Thanks again, George." He hung up and turned to Ruth with a gleam in his eye. "It seems news travels fast in this town. George just got a call from Richard Anderson." "Who's that?" Ruth asked. "The owner of Lux Motors," Thomas explained. "Apparently he's cutting his business trip short and flying back tonight. Peter called him immediately after I left." Ruth's eyes widened. "Oh my, is he angry?" Thomas laughed. "According to George, he's terrified. Richard and I have never met, but he knows my reputation from business circles. The idea that his dealership mistreated the wife of Thomas Wilson has him in a panic. And that's not all." He picked up the remote and turned on the television, flipping to the local news channel. George said we might want to watch the noon news. They didn't have to wait long. After a segment about road construction and a brief weather report, the anchor's expression turned serious. In local business news, questions are being raised about customer service practices at Lux Motors after an elderly woman was allegedly escorted from the premises yesterday when attempting to purchase a vehicle. Our reporter Nora Taylor has the story. The screen switched to the reporter Thomas had spoken with at the dealership. She was standing outside Lux Motors, the gleaming cars visible through the windows behind her. "Thank you, Jim." "I came to Lux Motors this morning to do a story on customer service in luxury businesses, but found myself in the middle of a developing situation. Yesterday, 73-year-old Ruth Wilson visited the dealership intending to purchase a high-end vehicle as an anniversary gift for her husband, using money from a recent inheritance. The camera cut to a photo of Ruth that must have been taken at a community event last year. She gasped, pressing her hand to her mouth. According to Mrs. Wilson's husband, Thomas Wilson, former CEO of Wilson Investment Partners, his wife was dismissed by salespeople who judged her based on her appearance and age, and was ultimately escorted from the property by security. The report continued, showing footage of Thomas exiting the dealership and briefly speaking with the reporter. The camera then returned to Nora, who was now interviewing a young couple who had been in the showroom during Thomas's visit. "We couldn't hear everything, but it was clear something serious was happening," the woman said. "The managers looked really uncomfortable." When the segment ended, Thomas turned off the television and looked at Ruth, who seemed stunned. "I never expected it to be on the news," she said softly. "I'm not sure how I feel about that." Before Thomas could respond, the phone rang again. This time it was their daughter, Anne. "Mom? Dad, are you okay? I just saw the news report about what happened at that car dealership." Ruth took the phone, assuring Anne that everything was fine and promising to explain the whole situation later. As soon as she hung up, the phone rang again. Their son, then their neighbor, then Ruth's sister. Word was spreading rapidly. By mid-afternoon, the house was filled with flowers. The first arrangement arrived just after lunch. A beautiful bouquet with a card from George Phillips expressing his deepest apologies for the treatment Mrs. Wilson received at a competing establishment. More followed from their children, from old friends and colleagues of Thomas, and even from the reporter who had done the news segment. Ruth moved through the house, finding vases for all the flowers, slightly overwhelmed by the attention. "It seems like such a fuss over nothing," she said as she arranged lilies in a crystal vase. "All I wanted was to buy you a car." Thomas, who had changed out of his suit into more comfortable clothes, came up behind her, and wrapped his arms around her waist. "It's not nothing," he said softly. "It's about respect. And it's about standing up for what's right." The doorbell rang yet again. Thomas sighed with a smile. "That's probably more flowers. I'll get it." But when he opened the door, it wasn't a delivery person standing on their porch. It was a man in his early 50s wearing an expensive suit and looking distinctly uncomfortable. Behind him in the driveway was a sleek black luxury car. "Mr. Wilson?" the man asked, extending his hand. "I'm Richard Anderson, owner of Lux Motors. I was hoping I might have a word with you and Mrs. Wilson." Thomas studied him for a moment, then stepped back, opening the door wider. "Please come in." Richard entered the house, immediately removing his hat. When Ruth came in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, he turned to her with a look of genuine contrition. "Mrs. Wilson, I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry I am for what happened to you at my dealership yesterday. There is absolutely no excuse for how you were treated." Ruth glanced at Thomas, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. "Thank you for coming in person," she said. "Would you like some tea?" The three of them sat in the living room. Richard perched awkwardly on the edge of an armchair while Ruth poured tea from a floral pot that had been a wedding gift half a century ago. The contrast between their modest, comfortable home and Richard's obvious wealth was striking. But there was no tension in the air, only a sense of things being set right. "I flew back as soon as I heard what happened," Richard explained. "I want you both to know that the behavior you experienced does not reflect the values of my company. I've already spoken with Peter and Daniel, and there will be significant changes made." Thomas nodded, stirring a small spoonful of sugar into his tea. "What kind of changes?" Richard set down his cup. "For starters, Peter has been demoted. He'll no longer be managing the floor. Daniel is on probation, and both will be required to complete extensive training on respectful customer service." He hesitated, then added, "I've also scheduled mandatory sensitivity training for all staff, focusing specifically on treating all customers with equal respect regardless of appearance, age, or any other factor." Ruth, who had been quiet, finally spoke up. "It wasn't just about me, you know. I kept thinking about other people who might be treated that way, people who might not have a husband who could make things right." Richard nodded solemnly. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Wilson, and that's why I'm not just addressing this specific incident. I'm implementing new company-wide policies across all 5 of my dealerships." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "Such as?" "Mystery shoppers of various ages and backgrounds who will regularly test our customer service. A new feedback system that asks specific questions about how respected customers felt during their visit. And a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior of any kind." Richard reached into his jacket and removed an envelope. "I've also brought this for you, Mrs. Wilson. A formal written apology." Ruth took the envelope but didn't open it. "Thank you. Additionally," Richard continued, "I'd like to offer you the vehicle you were interested in yesterday, at cost. No markup whatsoever." Thomas and Ruth exchanged a glance, having a silent conversation in the way that only couples who have spent decades together can do. "That's very generous," Thomas said carefully, "but I think we'll be taking our business to Phillips Luxury Automobiles. George has been extremely supportive throughout this situation." Richard nodded, looking disappointed but not surprised. "I understand completely. In that case, I hope you'll accept my apology and know that your experience has led to real change." After Richard left, Ruth and Thomas stood on the porch watching his car disappear down the street. The afternoon sun was warm on their faces, and somewhere in the distance a lawnmower hummed. "Well," Ruth said, slipping her arm through Thomas's, "that was certainly not how I expected my car shopping experience to go." Thomas laughed, the tension of the past 2 days finally melting away. "No, I suppose not. But you know what? I think some good came out of it." Ruth rested her head against his shoulder, the way she had done countless times over their 50 years together. "Yes," she said softly, "I think it did." They stood there for a long moment, watching the play of light and shadow on their front lawn, content in each other's company and in the knowledge that sometimes standing up for what's right can make a difference, not just for themselves, but for others who might come after them. 2 weeks had passed since the eventful day at Lux Motors. The flowers that had filled Ruth and Thomas's home had begun to wilt. The news cycle had moved on to other stories, and life had largely returned to its comfortable routine. Thomas had returned the borrowed Rolls-Royce to George with heartfelt thanks, and the formal written apology from Richard Anderson sat in a drawer, read once but not forgotten. The morning was bright and clear as Ruth stood in the kitchen preparing breakfast. Thomas was in the garden, checking on his tomato plants and talking to the neighbor's cat that often wandered over to keep him company. Through the window, Ruth could see him gesturing animatedly, probably explaining some gardening technique to the uninterested feline. The sight made her smile. Some things never changed even after 50 years. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was George Phillips. "Good morning, Ruth," he said, his voice warm and friendly. "I hope I'm not calling too early." "Not at all," she assured him. "Thomas is just out with the tomatoes as usual." George chuckled. "Well, I have some news I think you'll both be interested in. The car you ordered has arrived, and it's even better than expected. We've got it all ready for you, whenever you'd like to come pick it up." Ruth felt a flutter of excitement. After their experience at Lux Motors and the subsequent events, she and Thomas had visited Phillips' luxury automobiles together. George had given them a personal tour of the showroom, introduced them to all his staff, and helped them select the perfect car, a sleek, midnight blue luxury sedan with all the features Thomas had ever mentioned wanting. "That's wonderful news," Ruth said. "We could come by this afternoon if that works for you." "Perfect," George replied. "I'll make sure everything is ready, and Ruth, I want you to know again how sorry I am for what happened at Lux. Not all dealerships operate that way." After hanging up, Ruth went out to the garden to share the news with Thomas. He was kneeling beside his tomato plants, carefully tying a wayward stem to a support stake. "The car's ready," she said, watching his face light up with boyish enthusiasm. Even at 75, Thomas could still look like the young man she had fallen in love with half a century ago. "Excellent," he said, brushing the dirt from his hands as he stood. "Let's go after lunch." As they prepared to leave that afternoon, Ruth found herself taking extra care with her appearance. She chose a pretty floral dress instead of her usual casual clothes and even applied a touch of lipstick. Thomas noticed immediately. "You look beautiful," he said, taking her hand as they walked to their old car for what would be one of its final journeys. "I'm just making sure no one mistakes me for someone who can't afford a luxury car," she replied with a wink. The drive to Phillips' luxury automobiles took about 20 minutes. As they pulled into the parking lot, Ruth noticed something unusual. There seemed to be more people than expected for a Tuesday afternoon, and several of them were holding cameras. "Thomas," she said, a note of concern in her voice. "What's going on?" He squeezed her hand reassuringly. "I have no idea. Let's find out." As they stepped out of their car, George emerged from the showroom to greet them, a broad smile on his face. Behind him stood several of his employees, all looking excited. "Ruth, Thomas," George called, walking toward them with his hand extended. "Welcome. We've been looking forward to this all day." Before Ruth could ask about the crowd, a young woman with a microphone approached, followed by a cameraman. Ruth recognized her immediately. Nora Taylor, the reporter who had covered the Lux Motors story. "Mrs. Wilson," Nora said warmly, "would you mind if we film you receiving your new car today? Your story really resonated with our viewers, and many have asked for a follow-up." Ruth looked at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. "I suppose that would be fine," she said somewhat hesitantly. "Though I'm not sure why anyone would be interested." Nora smiled. "You'd be surprised. Sometimes the stories that seem smallest to us are the ones that touch the most hearts." With the cameras rolling, George led them into the showroom. The space was brightly lit and welcoming, with comfortable seating areas scattered among the displayed vehicles. Unlike at Lux Motors, the staff here moved around with relaxed professionalism, giving potential customers space to browse while remaining available to help. "Now," George said, gesturing toward a door at the back of the showroom, "if you'll follow me, your car is waiting in our delivery area." As they walked through the door, Ruth gasped. There in the center of the room, under soft lighting, sat their new car, but it wasn't alone. Surrounding it were at least 20 people, many of whom Ruth recognized from their community. Their children and grandchildren were there, along with neighbors, friends from church, and even the mail carrier who had been delivering to their house for over a decade. "Surprise!" everyone called in unison. Ruth turned to Thomas, confusion and delight mingling on her face. "What is this?" Thomas looked equally surprised. "I had no idea," he said, turning to George for explanation. George stepped forward, beaming with pride. "When word got out that you were picking up your car today, people started calling. They wanted to be here to show their support. It seems your stand against disrespect and ageism struck a chord with a lot of folks." One of Ruth's oldest friends, Betty, came forward and hugged her tightly. "You stood up for all of us," she whispered. "Do you know how many times I've been ignored in stores or treated like I'm invisible because of my age? What happened to you happens to older people every day." Ruth hadn't thought of it that way. She had been focused on her own humiliation, then on Thomas's response to it. She hadn't considered the broader implications of what had happened. As if reading her thoughts, George continued, "After your story aired, we received dozens of calls from older customers sharing similar experiences, not just at car dealerships, but at electronics stores, high-end clothing shops, even restaurants. Your willingness to speak up has started important conversations about how businesses treat older customers." Thomas squeezed Ruth's hand, pride evident in his eyes. "See? I told you some good would come of this." Their granddaughter Lily bounced forward excitedly. "Grandma, you're famous. My friends at school all saw you on the news." Ruth laughed, still somewhat overwhelmed by the attention. "Well, I certainly didn't expect all this when I decided to buy your grandfather a car." George handed Thomas the keys to their new vehicle. "Now, would you like to take it for a test drive? I think you'll find it lives up to all expectations." While Thomas examined the car with George, pointing out features and asking questions, Ruth found herself surrounded by women from her community, many of whom she had known for years. "You know," said Eleanor, who ran the local library, "after I saw your story, I went into that electronics store that had dismissed me last month. I walked right up to the manager and told him I wanted to speak to someone who wouldn't assume I didn't know about computers, just because I have gray hair." "What happened?" Ruth asked. Eleanor grinned. "He apologized and helped me himself. I bought the laptop I wanted, and he even offered me a discount." Similar stories circulated among the group, small victories inspired by Ruth's experience. She hadn't set out to become a symbol of standing up against age discrimination, but somehow, that's exactly what had happened. When it was time for them to drive their new car home, everyone gathered around to see them off. The reporter Nora asked for one final comment. "Mrs. Wilson, what would you say to businesses that might dismiss older customers based on appearance?" Ruth thought for a moment. "I'd say that respect should be given to everyone, regardless of how they look or how old they are. And I'd remind them that appearances can be deceiving. You never know who might walk through your door." As they drove away in their beautiful new car, Ruth looked over at Thomas, who was exploring all the features with childlike delight. "You know," she said, "this wasn't at all how I planned to surprise you for our anniversary." He laughed, reaching over to take her hand. "It turned out better than either of us could have imagined." The next few days brought more surprises. Letters arrived from all over the state. Older people sharing their own stories of being dismissed or disrespected because of their age, thanking Ruth for speaking up. A community organization that advocated for senior citizens called to ask if she would consider sharing her experience at their next meeting. But perhaps the most unexpected development came a month later, when Ruth received a call from Peter. "The former floor manager at Lux Motors, Mrs. Wilson," he said, his voice hesitant. "I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from Mr. Anderson." "Not at all," Ruth replied, curious about why he would be contacting her. "I wanted to thank you," Peter continued. "After what happened, I was demoted and nearly lost my job. At first I was angry, but then I started thinking about how I'd been treating people, not just you, but anyone who didn't look like a serious buyer to me." He paused, and Ruth could hear the genuine reflection in his voice. "My own grandmother called me after she saw the news story. She said she'd experienced similar treatment and asked if that's how I'd want someone to treat her. It really hit home." "That's very honest of you," Ruth said. "I've been given a second chance at Lux," Peter explained, "not as a manager but as a regular salesperson. And I've made a personal commitment to treat every customer with the same respect, regardless of how they're dressed or how old they are. I just wanted you to know that your stand made a difference, at least to me." After hanging up, Ruth sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on everything that had happened since that humiliating day at the dealership. What had begun as a simple desire to buy her husband an anniversary gift had turned into something much larger. A moment of standing up not just for herself, but inadvertently for others who had experienced similar treatment. That evening, as she and Thomas sat in their usual spots on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. She shared Peter's call with him. "You know," Thomas said thoughtfully, "sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest stands." Ruth nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder as she had done countless times over their 50 years together. "I never meant to start anything. I just wanted to buy you a car," Thomas chuckled, wrapping his arm around her. "And what a fine car it is. But what you really gave me, what you gave us all, was a reminder that every person deserves respect, regardless of age or appearance." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the evening sky, they continued rocking gently in their porch swing, comfortable in the knowledge that sometimes the most meaningful gifts aren't the ones that come with keys and engines, but the ones that come from standing up for what's right, even when you're wearing a slightly frayed blue cardigan.